As you know, I'm Jake Wilson, and I've written a series of songs for Captain Scott and his polar team. What I thought I'd do, if you can all hear me, are you okay if I talk at this level you can hear? And if you've got the time, I'll just talk through a little bit what I've done and then talk a bit about each of the men and sing you their song. So that might take a little bit over 3/4 of an hour, something like that. I suppose until about 3 years ago, my knowledge of Captain Scott and his final expedition to Antarctica was pretty limited. It's one of those stories which lodges in the subconscious, particularly if you're English, you know this story. So I knew the basic outline that Scott and a small team had travelled towards the South Pole in the beginning of 1912, that they'd reached the pole only to find that a Norwegian team who'd travelled with sledges pulled by dogs had reached the pole a month before them, and then Scott and his party turned northwards, pulling all of their equipment on foot, and over the course of that return journey, trying to get back to their hut, all 5 of them died. So that much I knew. I think my knowledge was based on a children's book, a Ladybird children's book, which I must have had. Then about 3 years ago, visiting my parents' house, I saw a book that I hadn't seen before on the shelves and pulled it down, and it proved to be a very early edition of Captain Scott's journals. And I guess I hadn't realised that the reason we know all of this is because Captain Scott himself wrote in his journal what was happening up until the point where he said he didn't have the strength to write any more. And so we have the whole story from his point of view. And I was hooked. And then I started reading more about it and found that other men in the expedition had written journals as well, and they had survived. So I read those journals too, and then I read accounts written by other team members of the expedition, and gradually started building up this very clear picture of the characters of the men involved. And one of the things that I realised straight away is that when people are involved in an event like this, a kind of iconic event, they stop being people, they become a story or a myth. These were 5 real people, and I got very kind of deeply involved in the 5 men and their real characters, what they were like, what they achieved. And something else that I realised was that they were 5 very different men, deliberately. Captain Scott wanted the team to represent England, Ireland, Wales and Scotland. He wanted to have people who were working class, middle class, upper class. He wanted people from the army, the navy, the marine, and from civilian life. So these 5 men were actually very different. And so it seemed even more important that I captured their real character. So that's what I've tried to do. Each song tries to capture what the last thoughts might have been of each of these 5 very different men. So the first song is for Edgar Evans, the first member of the team to die, and he's standing at the back at the far right, if you're looking at the photograph. Now Evans was the working class member of the team, and as a result I think he had the most riding on being first to reach the pole, that his life would have been transformed from being a low-level sailor to being a celebrity, being able to retire, open a pub, have a completely different life. And so for him, when they reached the pole second, that dream was shattered. In addition, you can see he's a big man. He was the biggest man in the expedition, the strongest man, and by this point, when they were running out of food, he began to feel it the most, so his body packed up on him. Before the other men, he started struggling, and I think that he was kind of bewildered by this, that he'd been the strongest and able to rely on his body, and it was failing him when he needed it not to. He'd also cut himself repairing one of the sledges, and that wound wouldn't heal because he was malnourished, and then he fell in crevices and hit his head very badly on one of these occasions, and suddenly it just went very, very quickly downhill. But I was struck by the fact that even on the day that he died, he was in harness helping to pull the sledge that the team were dragging with them. It was only in the very last hours of his life that he asked permission to come out of harness, to walk alongside the sledge. Then when he couldn't keep up with that, the rest of the team went ahead and said that he should catch them. They had their lunch, realised he hadn't caught up with them, and went back, and they found him lying in the snow, and he died shortly afterwards. And I tried to think what would be driving him on, like keeping him going, to keep on pulling, to keep trying to get back. And I had this idea that it was that he wanted to get home, back to Wales, where he came from. And so I called his song Home. oh Captain, is our journey done? Did we struggle so far to find the prize already won? Must we trudge empty-handed back to the ship? Can a dragon still fly when its wings have been clipped? Far from home, home. Did we haul our way south, battle hunger and cold? For the Norskies to dash, the Norskies to dash, for the Norskies to dash, all our dreams at the pole. All it takes to cross the line between death and life is a slip of the foot or a slip of the knife, and there'll be no flag to wrap me in my unmarked grave, no earth below me and above me, no waves far for home, home, to be back in the gower, to glimpse raw city sands. And I'll try not to fall, I'll try not to fall, I'll try hard not to fall, when it's too much to stand. Pulled and I pulled till my strength was all gone. I made myself walk till I just couldn't carry on. And when you went ahead, had your lunch and brewed your tea, I crawled through the snow on my hands and my knees to get home, home. To the land of my fathers, my children and my wife. But I pulled to the end, I pulled to the end. Oh, I'd pulled to the end. Can you all hear if that's how it's going to be? If that's going to be all right? So after Evans's death, the next member of the team to start going downhill was Lawrence Oates. Oates is standing at the far left in the photograph, if you want to see what he looks like. Now, Oates was a soldier. He was a captain in the Royal Dragoons, who were cavalrymen, and he was an expert in horses as a result. And his job in the expedition was to look after the ponies that were going to help pull the equipment towards the South Pole at the beginning of the journey. So I wanted his song to have a feel of pony to it, so it's got a kind of galloping feel, combined with a military theme. So I was trying to capture his cavalry and military background with the sound of the song. Now, Oates' military background caused him problems. He'd fought in the Boer War 10 years before this expedition and had been wounded in the leg. And when he started being undernourished, that wound seems to have opened up. And I think if you look at the photo, he's standing kind of lopsided, rather awkwardly. I think one of his legs is already causing him problems. In addition to that, he started suffering very severe frostbite as well, and he gradually deteriorated and realised that he was slowing the team down, and that if he slowed them down too much, he might cause the rest of his companions to fail to get home. And he was faced with this choice of what to do. To start off with, there was the possibility of taking opium tablets and committing suicide. He rejected that. He asked if they would leave him in his sleeping bag and just leave him. And the rest of the team refused to do that. And eventually, he decided all that he could do was step out of the tent during a blizzard, sacrifice himself, and hope that the remaining 3 men would get through as a result. And that's what he did. And his famous last words are recorded in Captain Scott's journal: "I'm just going outside, and maybe some time." And so I've called his song "Maybe Some Time." Now, reading the journals of the men, they recorded what they were reading themselves on the journey. And one of the other team members referred to a Tennyson poem that he was reading as they travelled south, a poem called In Memoriam, which is a very long poem musing on the death of a close friend of Tennyson's. And I thought, well, he had clearly been moved by this poem, perhaps I should read it as well, and I read it. And as I read it, there were passages in it which basically described Oates' situation in the last days of his life. It was kind of uncanny. There were phrases to do with the question of taking opiates, wanting to sleep and not wake up, and these sorts of things. And so I've woven some of the Tennyson words into this song. Another thing which may be of interest, there's a reference in the song to Napoleon. Now, when I was reading this early edition of Captain Scott's journals, there were some of the famous photographs from the expedition reproduced in it. One of them is the whole team sitting around a table in the hut in Antarctica having a dinner. And tiny, on the wall of the hut, there was a picture which seemed to be Napoleon. I made a little note of this in my notebook. And months later, I was reading about Oates, and it turns out Napoleon was his hero. He only took one book with him to Antarctica, and that was an account of some of Napoleon's military exploits. And he only took one picture, where all the other men had family photos up in the hut. Apparently Oates just had a picture of Napoleon, and that was what I had seen. Tiny, tiny picture of Napoleon on the wall of the hut. And I thought there was an irony there as well, to be a soldier who admired Napoleon travelling through the snow. And Napoleon, of course, came unstuck when he travelled to Russia and got caught in the weather there. I thought that was a strange parallel there then. So that's Napoleon. Anyway. You're happy that I'll talk like this and then play? Is that all right? Okay, good. Well, I'll just tune my guitar quickly and then maybe some time for Lawrence Oates. I think my guitar's not used to being so warm. slept and woke with pain. I almost wish no more to wake again. And oh, for an opiate trebly strong to drug down this blindfold sense of wrong. No surrender, no surrender. No surrender, no surrender. Like Napoleon under Russian skies, we lost our battle with the snow and the ice. No heroes welcome our only retreat, no hope of glory, only defeat. But I soldier on, I soldier on. I soldier on, I soldier on. Now the grave seems bright to me, stepping outside seems right to me. From a pick to the head, a bullet to the brain. You can do it to a horse, you can't do it to a man. Maybe sometime, maybe sometime. Maybe sometime, maybe sometime. Oh, maybe sometime, maybe sometime. So after Oates had left the tent, the remaining three men, Scott, Wilson and Bowers, continued trying to get back to the hut, pulling their equipment on the sledge, setting up the tent, pulling their equipment, setting up the tent, all the time running out of food and fuel. And they knew that a certain distance in front of them was a massive depot they had laid the previous year, 1-ton depot full of food and fuel. And they were struggling to get towards that point. Now when they were 11 miles from that depot, they camped, and they had enough food and fuel for maybe a day. And by this stage they were eating cold rations, they'd really run that short of fuel. And they were all in terrible condition. But what they were hoping was that perhaps two of them would be able to make a kind of last-ditch effort to get to One Ton Depot and back to the tent, bringing what was necessary. This would be a 22-mile round trip. But it turns out they never set out. A blizzard broke out, and the men were confined to the tent, and as far as it's possible to tell, it simply wasn't impossible. If the blizzard ever stopped, it was impossible for them to set out, or perhaps the blizzard just lasted so long that they couldn't set out at all. And so these three men died together in the tent. Now, the next song is for Edward Wilson. He's sitting on the floor to the right in the photograph. Wilson was the chief of the scientific part of the expedition. He was the doctor on the team. And he was also an amazing artist. I don't know if any of you have seen any of the work he produced in Antarctica, but he produced everything from panoramic landscape drawings to watercolours of strange phenomena you get with the sun, with multiple suns appearing in the sky, through to wildlife images, through even when I was in Christchurch, I saw a painting he'd done of part of the intestine of a penguin they had caught to show the parasites living in it. I mean, really detailed wildlife drawings and paintings. And so I wanted to capture something of his sensitivity to the colour and lack of colour of the landscape. Wilson was also a very religious man, a devout Christian. And when he realised that he probably wasn't going to get home, he wrote a series of letters, 2 to his wife, 1 to his parents, and 1 to a close friend. And in all of these letters I was struck that there was one phrase which appeared again and again. It was "all is well." So throughout these letters the phrase "all is well" appeared 7 or 8 times. And so I've called Wilson's song "All's Well." I suppose his belief was that whatever happened to him was part of God's plan for his life, and if God's plan was that he was to die in Antarctica, then as far as he was concerned, all was well. That was a divine plan. And he was very keen to reassure the people who were going to be left behind that he was content with what was happening. Also, the fact that there was kind of repeated, this phrase, made me think that the words that I wrote should be slightly repetitive. So they're drawn from his last letters, not literally, but in spirit, I suppose, and there's this repetitive feel to them. And I also wanted the guitar to sound like the snow falling around the tent, which trapped them in it. There's one last thing which may be of interest. The song opens with a reference to a bird. Now, I mentioned Wilson was a wildlife expert. He was in particular an expert in birds, and throughout the expedition he paid a lot of attention to what birds they were seeing. And in his journal on the way towards the South Pole, he commented on the fact that they saw a single bird flying above the team a long way south, much further south than they were expecting to see any wildlife like that. And he noted in his diary he wasn't sure how this bird was surviving so far from the coast, so far from food. And I thought there was a kind of strange irony there, that only a few months later Wilson himself would be in that same position, too far from a source of food. Yet only a few months before he had been concerned for the fate of this bird in that same situation. This would be all's well for Edward Wilson. Bird circled high, the bird circled high all alone. It was too far south, we were too far south to get home. The snow it fell, the snow it fell for days. Colours they fade, colours all fade away. But all's well. All's well. spirit is willing and my faith is strong to the end. But my flesh is weak and I almost long for the end. Oh, thy kingdom comes and thy will is done always. As the colours they fade, the colours all fade away. All's well. Polly, my dear, my life is small to me now. Oh, Polly, my dear, our love is all to me now. Though death draws near, I've nothing to fear today. Colours they fade, the colours all fade away. All's So the next song is for Henry Bowers, who is sitting to the left there at the front. Bowers is actually the photographer of this photo. I don't know if you realise this is a self-portrait, and he has a little string in his hand that he was pulling in order to release the shutter of the camera. There wasn't a sixth man there. This was a self-portrait. Now Bowers was also a very religious man like Wilson, but his Christianity was a bit more robust, a bit more onward Christian soldiers. His attitude was God was with him, as a result he would survive. It was as simple as that. And this kind of attitude stood him in good stead earlier in the expedition. There's an episode which gets a passing reference in the song where Bowers and two companions were caught on the sea ice, on the frozen sea, and had to pitch their tent there. And they woke up in the night to find that the ice had actually broken up and they were floating out to sea. Now, an ordinary man at this point would have told his colleagues just to get the hell off this floating ice to the solid surface. Bowers was confident that he would survive, and so he insisted that they pack all their equipment up, pack the tent up, load the sledges, get the ponies who were with them, and then they leapfrogged from floating piece of ice to floating piece of ice to try and get back to the solid surface. Now at this point killer whales appeared, circling around the broken fragments of ice, Okay, they kept on going, they thought they would get back, and then they reached what they thought was going to be the solid surface, only to find that there was 30 foot of water separating them from it, filled with killer whales. And at this point, Bowers said it was his duty to remain on the floating ice with everything, and one of the other men should go and try and find a route back to the solid surface. And by a miracle, this man did. He got Captain Scott and some other members of the expedition. They managed to rescue all the men, all the equipment, and in the end, one of the ponies. But this is the kind of man that Bowers was. It wasn't enough for him just to get safely back. He needed to do it properly. There's another experience. I don't know if you've heard of the worst journey in the world. But before the polar journey, Bowers, Wilson and a third man undertook a journey in the Antarctic winter, so in pitch darkness, in temperatures of minus 70 degrees, to go and find penguin eggs. Now, the penguins only laid their eggs during the Antarctic winter. This was when you could find them. And the idea was that if they could gather enough of the eggs, they would learn something about evolution. At this stage, people believed that in embryo, you would see evolution occurring if you've got enough samples. It's totally untrue, but at the time this was the belief. And so they went to find penguin eggs. The penguin, the most primitive bird, was going to hopefully provide the link between dinosaurs and birds. If they set off in the pitch darkness, had a horrendous journey. It was so cold that the nerves in the jaw of one of the men froze and his teeth shattered because he was shivering so much. Their plan was when they got to the destination near the penguin rookery, they would build an igloo and move into that and live in that rather than their tent and operate from that as their base. They got there, they built this stone igloo, moved into it, and then their tent flew away. And so they thought, well, we might manage to get back using the canvas roof of the igloo as a kind of artificial tent, and then that blew away. And they were left, these three men, lying in their sleeping bags for 48 hours during a gale and blizzard. And during this time, Bowers sustained himself by singing hymns. And so I've given his song the feel of a hymn. It's got kind of snippets of various hymns that you may or may not recognise as part of it. Now, when it came to being trapped in this final tent with Scott and Wilson, Bowers wrote one letter, which was to his mother. And in this letter, he insisted that he was still strong, that he was confident of surviving thanks to his faith in God, but that if he didn't survive, he wanted her to know that his death would just be sleep in the cold. And so I've called this song Sleep in the Cold. Now, I don't know if you're aware, the reason we know all of this is because by some miracle, the tent was found. 8 months later, the search party set out looking for it. 150 miles from the hut, they found the tent with Scott, Bowers and Wilson's bodies in it, and with the journals, all the information which told the story was there. And they actually commented on the fact that when they found Bowers' body, he was inside his sleeping bag, seemingly fast asleep. And I thought that was kind of telling, that he had said that his death would just be sleep in the cold, and that was how it came out, that his faith gave him the strength to face death in this way. There's one other little... Sorry, I feel like I'm going on and on. Is this... Okay, there's one other little bit of information that may be interesting. Of all of the men, Bowers was the one who was most critical of the Norwegians. When the team discovered that Amundsen, the Norwegian leader, was taking his team to the south rather than to the North Pole, where he had said he was going, Bowers wrote in his journal that Amundsen was a sneaking, backhanded ruffian, which I think is pretty strong. And even when the British team reached the South Pole, Bowers noted in his journal that the British journey was the greatest journey ever undertaken by man, because they had pulled the equipment themselves. They hadn't used dogs, as the Norwegians had. Now, you'll see in the photo there's 5 men in the polar party. Originally, the plan was that it should have been 4 men, and Bowers was added as a 5th man, very much at the last minute. I think he was just so tough that Scott realised he was the kind of man you needed with you in a difficult time, so he was added. But this put all sorts of pressures on the team. Their rations had been packaged up for 4 men. The cooker was designed to cook for 4 men, so this caused all sorts of problems. In addition, Bowers had put some of his equipment in a depot because he wasn't planning on being part of this final push for the pole, and that included his ski. The other men all had wooden ski, and the idea was that this would help them to stay on the surface of the snow as they pulled the sledge rather than sinking into it. Now, Bowers didn't have his ski. And he was a little man, he was only 5 feet tall. And so you have to imagine he was pulling the sledge, sinking deep into the snow, while the other men at least had the advantage of the ski. And in Bauer's journal there are these little things, only a few hundred miles until I see my dear ski again, and these little plaintive comments. But I think underneath it he was probably proud that he wasn't using ski, that he was on foot. After all, ski were a Norwegian invention as well, so I'm sure he was kind of a little suspicious of them too. And so I wanted to pick up on this idea as well, this kind of pride in doing things the British way. So this will be Sleep in the Cold for Birdie Bowers. Oh, Birdie Bowers, because of his extraordinarily large nose, he was called Birdie by the rest of the team. Rather go with no ski than the Norski way. Give me good old-fashioned British man-haul sledging every day. And the snow it may blind, and the frost may bite, I'll battle on, I'll keep fighting the good fight. And with God as my guide, I'll head straight towards the goal. When the pulling is all done, then I'll just sleep in the cold. If Christ is my companion and the harness as my friend, I'll brave every crack and crevice, or I'll struggle to the end. And the ice may break up, and the orcas circle near, to catch in my breath will be the only sign of fear. If the wind it should change, and the ice just doesn't hold, I'll float calmly out to sea, and I'll just sleep in the cold. Our food is running short, and the fuel is almost gone, but I'm far from finished, oh I still feel strong. strong, and the shadows may close in, and the darkness threaten me, but death will have no sting, and the grave no victory, for I'll never get tired, and now I'll never grow old. I'll lie happy in my bag, and I'll just sleep in the cold. That brings us to the last song of the set, which is for Captain Scott himself, standing there in the middle in the photograph. Now, the point where the British team realised that they were second to the pole actually happened a little way before they got there. As they travelled south, they spotted something black in the distance. And to start off with, they tried to dismiss it from their minds. Maybe it was a piece of rock or something like that. But as they got closer, they could see it was something man-made. And when they reached it, they found that it was a black flag. And it proved to be one of the Norwegians' black marker flags that they had used to mark their own depots. There was a very thorough system of marking the depot with a black flag and then placing further black flags either side of it so that the Norwegian team would be able to find their own supplies on the return journey. And I tried to imagine what it would feel like having walked for 800 miles, dragging your stuff through these horrific conditions, only to find this black flag, which showed that they were going to be second to the pole. And I had this thought that maybe Captain Scott would become obsessed with this flag in some strange way. He referred to it as the ominous black flag in his journal. And in fact, on the return journey from the South Pole, the British team collected this black flag, and they carried it with them, and it was found in the tent with their bodies by the search party. It's now back in Cambridge in England in the museum of the Scott Polar Research Institute. So this kind of confirmed in my mind that the flag had a deep impact on the men, that they carried it with them. Then also, reading Scott's journals, he was someone who clearly saw things very much in black and white. That you'll read about a particular person in his journal being praised as a treasure or a marvel, and then a few pages later that same person may come in for some heavy criticism. And similarly with situations, things are either going fantastically or they're going terribly. And you get the impression that he was someone whose view of how things were shifted wildly from very positive to very negative. And this kind of tied in with the whiteness of the snow and the blackness of the flag and so on and so on. So that's become the theme of his song. And it's clear that he was a man who kind of struggled with himself. He obviously was concerned that he was idle. Even in his last letter to his wife, he says that he was by nature lazy. And in order to overcome being lazy, he made himself do stuff. This sort of thing. And you can really see that he was someone who basically was battling against his own self-doubt, his own anxieties and so on, so I wanted that to come through. And then one last thing which may make sense of the song. The team were carrying out scientific work even while they were on this journey, and on the return from the South Pole, even when they were running very short of food and were losing strength, they went geologizing for a day, looking for fossils. And the aim was to find evidence that once Antarctica had been a warm land where plants had grown, and also it might prove that Antarctica had once been part of a larger primeval landmass. And so they were keen to get this geological evidence. And they collected 35 pounds of fossils, and they dragged them with them. Even when they knew they weren't going to get back to the hut, they still dragged them with them. And those fossils were found on the sledge outside the tent 8 months later by this search party. They're now in the Natural History Museum, and they did indeed prove that Antarctica was once part of this kind of primordial landmass before the continents separated. And so those fossils were in coal, some of them, and I imagine those again black against the white. So there we are. We're full circle, back to Captain Scott and his journals. I'll now play Black Was the Flag. Thank you for coming. One last little thought before you all collapse. The song's supposed to have a kind of hypnotic trudging feel to it, because all of the men commented in their journals that when they were marching, pulling the sledge, it was extremely tedious, and that they just kind of settled into a rhythmic trudging, and their brains went blank. They talk about having kind of whiteness in their minds, and also they didn't have any dreams because their lives were so tedious. They commented on not dreaming as well, and so hopefully the song will hypnotise you without putting you to sleep. White were the nights, and white were the days. White was the path that we trod all the way. White were our thoughts as we hauled and we dragged. Black was the flag, black was the flag. White were our dreams, and white was our sleep. White was the hope that I struggled hard to keep. Black were the shadows of the doubts that I had. Black was the flag, black was the flag. Red was the blood of the ponies that we drove, and white was the snow that had stayed. Blue was the sky, so clear above. The black was their pain. White was the dawn, but black was the day. Black was the dog on my back all the way. Black were the leaves pressed hard in the cold. Black was the flag that we found at the pole. Black was the flag that fluttered at the pole. Red, white,